I'll try and smash through this relatively fast because there are obviously lots of questions already brewing. Okay, so I'm supposed to talk about the economy, which is a huge subject and many, many aspects to it. I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about milk, which Martin touched on briefly. I don't know how familiar people are with the milk scandal that came up recently, but just to fly through it. On July the 16th was the first point at which people became aware of something going on in Gansu, that the Ministry of Health was aware that there were kidney stone problems among babies who were drinking the Sanlu milk. Then August the 2nd, Fonterra, which was a New Zealand company, which was a major shareholder in Sanlu, learned of the problem and started to try and suggest that the province should do something about it. Nothing happened. Well, there was a silent recall, but no public recall. And then August the 8th, which is the important moment, was the opening of the Beijing Olympic Games. And that followed smoothly all the way through. There was nothing in the press. Nobody talked about it at all. On September the 1st, the Ministry of Health concluded that the powder was indeed the cause of the problem. On September the 8th, the New Zealand government started complaining to the Chinese authorities. And then on the 11th, and finally, Sanlu announced a public recall. And on the 13th, the Ministry of Health got involved. And so, we see there's a good kind of 2 months going on between the actual suggestion that there's a problem and anything coming through. And, like we talk about SARS, for example. I think SARS was 2003, when, everyone thought that there was going to be this internet explosion that was going to change the way in which things were happening. But, this is a very recent event, and, the fallout so far has been 6,000 infants reported ill and 4 reported dead. Obviously, the reports are not necessarily to be trusted. And, the milk scandal is one in a long line of scandals. I don't want to talk about the scandals too much, but there's obviously been the poisonous baby pajamas, the peeling lead paint on the toys. It kind of seems too bad that the babies keep getting hit up in a one-child policy environment. Then there's also been the melamine with the dog food, the melamine in the toothpaste, then all of the fake pharmaceuticals, antibiotics with nothing in them, and antibiotics even worse with 10% antibiotics in them. And you start wondering, and for me this milk thing was I had a slight kind of click moment. It seemed to be so far wrong that I kind of became aware that maybe how has this country got to the point in which it's got so badly off course? And even the most cynical analysis would say that there's a huge damage to the brand value of China through these kinds of events. Anyway, so as a way to start kind of approaching how China's got into this situation, then I want to flip back quickly 20 years ago. There was an enormous change. It was, probably the greatest change that ever occurred in the world when the Soviet Union collapsed and China started really opening up the period of the export processing zones. And in a very short period of time, then the labor force almost doubled. Like 1 billion new workers came on stream in the global labor force. What we call now the global labor force used to be just the Western economies which were trading. And when they did so, they didn't bring on a lot more capital. And as a result, then the capital to labor ratio dropped to about 55 to 60% of what it was before. And suddenly there was the greatest ever opportunity for labor arbitrage that the world had ever seen. Labor arbitrage basically means that there's a differential in the pricing in the markets. And what you could do as a company was that you could pay the Chinese worker one thing to make the product, and then you could sell it to the US consumer at another kind of price. And the split was so huge that people could make a lot of money out of this. And the great company that was fantastic at this was Walmart. And Walmart last year had revenues of $379 billion. I mean, it's really a lot. It's the #1 company in the world. And we're at a country would actually be number 30 by GDP. It just pips Belgium. And so, you kind of think, well, Walmart has achieved this kind of amazing thing for itself, and it achieved amazing things for the West. The gradient in the arbitrage was so steep that Walmart was able to slash prices massively in the West as well. So people in the West enjoyed what over the last 20 years has been a period of continuous, almost continuous global expansion with very low inflation. The inflation was kept low by the fact that the Chinese workers were producing things so cheap. And we all had, like the $2 t-shirts, the $15 TVs, the $80 sofas. In the UK, certainly, there's been a knock-on in that burglary rates have actually crashed because of the fact that there's nothing worth stealing in homes anymore. People used to go in and steal a video player, but now it's not worth anything. What can you sell a DVD player for these days if it's stolen? And so the West kind of enjoyed this terrific period. There was a sneeze with the dot-com boom, but apart from that, until now, we did very, very nicely out of it. And then at the same time, Africa in the last 10 years has had, particularly the areas which have had resources have enjoyed high commodity prices because of the fact that China's been using up so much resources. Recently, China promised 12 billion investment into the Congo, which has been rated by Goldman Sachs as the worst place in the world, bar none, to do business. And yet, the business is going in, even into the Congo. It's getting growth rates up at sort of 5–6%. And of course, the other people who've done well out of this, the whole labor debate is a big one. I don't want to touch on it right now. But the Chinese workers have been lifted out of poverty. So 200 million people have risen above the $1 a day poverty line. And essentially, in broad terms, the way in which people managed to keep coming to these factories is because the levels of indigence that were existent in the agricultural areas previously were so awful, and it was literal starvation aspects, and people would urbanize, come out of very low productivity agricultural environments and come into the urban environments and start working and producing growth and producing money. And this has been the sort of, the lowest hanging fruit, the sort of manufacturing end of things. And the problem with the manufacturing is, what's known as the Barbie conundrum, where the Chinese manage to manufacture the Barbie and they get $1 out of it, and then it goes back to the US where it's sold for $10 and $9 stay in the US. And so in terms of China's, moving on to the next level, and this is certainly part of the whole notion of halfway through, 30 years into the growth plan, and another 30 years China will be bigger than the US. We have to kind of change the way in which we're doing things in China and develop not only the manufacturing aspect, which is obviously the least sophisticated part of global capitalism. If we're really going to become global capitalists, then we have to get a hold of the consumption part as well, which has driven this move from the Mao to Mall, as it's commonly looked at. And it's something that everybody's sort of familiar with as an idea, but it is actually really profound in terms of what it's doing to the change that's suggested by society. I mean, Martin kind of talked a little bit about what it used to be a Chinese citizen. You thought that your ultimate idea was to strengthen the Chinese state, and now being a good Chinese citizen is to buy stuff that you want. And it's a very different way of looking at things. And we have the Mao over here, and then here again we have Deng Xiaoping, and he's holding up his hand and saying, yes, the mall is good, come in. The thing which is great about this picture is, of course, even in the picture of Deng Xiaoping, there's a shopping mall behind him right here, inside the shopping mall. And so it's doubly good to be shopping in China, and this is the way in which people want things to be going. Certainly economists for the last 10 years have been groaning, saying, China, come on, you've got to develop your consumer market a little bit better. And it's been absolutely exploding. This graph shows some retail sales. It's actually particularly astonishing because it's not retail sales, it's percentage growth in retail sales year on year. And so if we look at the early part of the graph in 2002, then retail sales in China were rising by 10% every year. And then, by 2004, it was 15% growth every year, and then by 2007, we're looking at 20% growth every year. And so the rate at which it's growing is growing. It's kind of exploding faster and faster, the consumer market. And everybody is extremely excited about the prospect of this because, of course, with China coming into the global capitalist economy, and it's unlike Japan and unlike South Korea in this, it's actually offering a huge new consumer base. The number of consumers that China is potentially putting on, into the product area is much, much bigger than South Korea or Singapore ever had to offer. And this is what's fueling this notion that there's a huge consumer boom waiting in China, and particularly now that growth is slowing down in the West, everyone's looking to it. In this slide, then we see over here the young Bill Gates back in 1980, just after Microsoft got its first deal with IBM. And Gates' vision for the US explicitly was, we'll have a PC on every desk and in every home, and that was visionary at the time. That was a kind of extraordinary idea. And now in 2008, then we've got Bill Amelio. We can see how much more stylish computer guys have got since Bill Gates. And he's hugging, Bill Amelio is the CEO of Lenovo, and here he is with the chair, and he's whispering through the chair's ear. It took 25 years for the PC to get to the first billion customers. The next billion should take 7. And he's talking about emerging markets in general, but massively it's actually talking about being able to sell that number of computers in China. And so all of the brands, all of the global brands are very excited to sell in China. All of the foreign brands have explicitly declared that China is their target market for the next 10 years. And so, we get the second version of the Barbie conundrum if all of the foreign brands moved in, where the Chinese, maybe they're getting $1 out of manufacturing, maybe if it's being bought in China, they'll get another $1 from distribution and point of sale. If the Barbie's bought in the Carrefour in Beijing, though, then the French get the $3, and the US, because they hold on to the brand, still get 5. And so what we have to, what the Chinese explicitly want to do is develop their own brands. And this is obviously, beyond the consumers, we've got to get the Chinese brands going. How are we going to get the Chinese brands going? And what are the big Chinese companies? What's the Walmart of China? And so what this slide shows is the top 29 companies top 29 Chinese companies, and these are in the Fortune 500. And so China has 29 companies now in the biggest 500 companies in the world, which is, it's not bad. And if we start looking at a few of the first ones, so it's Sinopec, which is a huge state Chinese oil firm. Then there's the China State Grid, the China National Petroleum, the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, China Mobile, China Life, and it's like China is in every single thing. And so, I don't want to read through all of them, but you can see these are the China ones, and it's like, wow, half the list, well, no, the vast majority of the list are Chinese state companies. But you kind of think, well, okay, there are a couple of ones which aren't. Like down at the bottom here, number 26, we've got Jardine Matheson. And then you look across at where it's based, and it's Hong Kong. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Well, who's based in Hong Kong? So I made them pink. And, you can see what's happening here is that, if the 29 companies, then, most of them are Chinese state-owned companies, and then the ones which aren't are in Hong Kong. And these ones all preceded the opening era. They were all founded, under the British era. Jardine Matheson in particular, hilariously, was founded by a Scot in the beginning of the 19th century, just when the British were first beginning to take an interest in China and getting their concession territories. And so, there's this problem that why is it that, the Chinese companies, there's this heavy state hand that seems to be going on in all of the big companies. And of course, this isn't so in America. If you look at the American companies, then places like Walmart and McDonald's and Starbucks and Microsoft, all of these places, at one point they were startups and they were family businesses, and then they grew and grew and grew. Whereas, all of these Chinese ones are these kind of Goliath state-owned enterprises, and they're all being bankrolled by state-owned banks, and they're all part of this notion of socialism with Chinese characteristics, or state capitalism, or bureaucratic capitalism, which is something which, I think the rest of the capitalist world is having a problem understanding as an idea. What quite does it mean to be a state-owned enterprise? And people are very suspicious. And there are a couple of very simple and, well-known examples. CNOOC, which is, it's down here, it's number 23, the China National Offshore Oil Company, tried to buy Unocal in 2005, an American oil firm. And Congress blocked it. They said, this is not an explicit for-profit company. It's shady, it's opaque, we're not quite sure what it's after. We don't want it to start taking a stake in our oil reserves. And then on the natural resources front, this year, Chinese mining firms, again, the Chinese mining firms are all in that 29 list, were trying to buy up oil reserves in Australia. And Australia noticed that what it seemed that the state-owned enterprises were doing was they were selling the ores at well below market prices back to China. So the state-owned enterprises were taking a huge loss on this, and they're price gouging the ores, in an unprofitable fashion, because they could pay less taxes on Australia by shipping it out at the lower price. And then once in China, then other state-owned enterprises could do the smelting and put it into the cabling for all of their new cities. And so again, it's not really an explicit private business, and it's not a business which the Australian government felt that it wanted to allow the continuing purchase of mines. Lenovo, which again was one of the Hong Kong companies, but again, it's very embroiled in the government in China, and the government seems to get into everything. And after they did take over IBM in 2005, and they didn't take over IBM just sold the PC part to Lenovo, which they weren't that keen on. And Lenovo bought it for the brand value. But as soon as they did that, then the US withdrew their contract from IBM for the supply of PCs to their embassies and government departments, because they were worried that if a Chinese state-owned, well, a Chinese company which was too embroiled with the state was making their computers, then they'd be easier to hack, and there's a possibility of IT warfare and so forth. And so, all of this is part of the background to this kind of haze about, this kind of like global concern about, what is a state-owned enterprise, what is socialism with Chinese characteristics, and, kind of what is a Chinese characteristic for an economist or for a company. And this is the point at which it starts becoming, difficult to think about because of the fact that these companies are so opaque and the whole system is so opaque. And it's defined, well, kind of like a way in which people talk about it is that it's federalism comes in at every level above cottage industry. And you kind of wonder, how that happens. The state is involved in everything above cottage industry level, and yet there's a lack of a clear regulatory framework, and there's a lack of a obvious rule of law, and there's a lack of a strong central control, which means that, and the lack of strong central control is an important part of the reform era, that instead of having central planning, then state officials, local state officials were given much greater control over what was going to happen. They were allowed to run things in such a way that would maximize economic growth. And so these local officials start to wield these enormous amounts of power, which is devolved to them from the central government. But they're operating in a largely lawless framework, which means that it's very effective for the low-hanging fruit. It's been terrific for these state officials who team up with private developers. It's something that Neville talked about, the relationship between the local officials and the local developers, and they'll requisition land, they'll move out farmers, they'll build a factory, the factory will make things for super cheap prices. And on that level, that sort of initial part of the economic growth is doing very well. But what it's produced now is a situation where you have this enormous rabble of these companies, or local provincial officials who are championing their own local hero companies. And they're not merging in the way that in the West, a lot of these smaller, you wouldn't have 2,000 coal mining companies in the West because they'd start to merge and technologies would be shared, it would become more efficient. In China, then each organization will have its local official championing it, and they're all struggling to undercut each other. Each one holds on to itself and is entering warfare with the surrounding companies, and they undercut each other in terms of costs, and they undercut each other in terms of standards. And this is how we come back round to the milk situation. You start to understand how is it that you get to the situation where the quality is so low because of the fact that there are all of these firms competing on these extremely, opaque playing fields. And the thing which is so striking about the milk situation, which is what I highlighted in this slide, is the fact that when the Ministry of Health held a conference and declared an emergency, then it found melamine not just in the one brand, the Sanlu, which was identified as causing the problem, but actually in 21 brands of milk. Like all of the milk all of the baby milk companies were, trying to cost cut in the same way they were trying to use melamine, which is a sweetener, instead of the natural products, and these were causing problems for the babies who were ingesting the milk. And you look at how is China actually dealing with this problem, and a year ago they executed the Chinese head of the Food and Drug Safety Agency after a huge scandal, and a year later we have the same kinds of problems coming up, and on from the SARS and so on. It doesn't seem to be working itself out. And so you have this situation where there's this problem where the companies themselves are obviously performing badly, but the state is so invested in maintaining the idea that things are okay that it's suppressing the press around these kind of things. And this is the kind of the creaking timbers of the central state, which doesn't want to admit that the local operatives have got too much power. And so it keeps on carrying out cover-ups, it keeps on maintaining opacity, which is damaging for the people, it's damaging for the transparency, for the investment, and it's not the best way to build a framework for thriving businesses. And so this is a kind of interesting question, why is it that the state's holding on to so much power? And this is a Deng Xiaoping quote from early in the reform era, which is particularly striking when you think about this. It says, "If the economy cannot be boosted, over the long run we will lose people's support at home and be oppressed and bullied by other nations throughout the world. A continuation of such a situation will only lead to the collapse and disintegration of the Chinese Communist Party." And it's a really striking statement because, it's like the idea, we've got to boost the economy and we have to, become a stronger nation. Everybody's kind of aware of this idea that, that China wants to maximize its economy, it wants to gain superpower status. But the core reason that Deng Xiaoping outlines for this is not to improve conditions for workers or, to gain a seat at the UN. It's because this is the way to maintain the continuing existence of the Communist Party. And the need to maintain the existence of the Communist Party is tilting the whole economy in a bizarre way. And it's happening particularly in terms of the distribution of money. When we look at this graph shows the labor costs, which are rising, albeit slowly, and the Gini coefficient, which is rising much faster. And we see that what's happening is that this cronyism, which is occurring with these top officials and these top developers who are siphoning off all of the money, and the government itself, which is siphoning off an enormous amount of money, whereas the people themselves are getting much less. And a quick way of demonstrating this, the government reserves at the end of 2007 were about $1.7 trillion. It's over $1,000 for every person in China, which is just being kept by the government rather than being distributed. And so, well, what are the government actually spending money on? And this graph kind of, shows the basic way in which, okay, so the state is siphoning up huge amounts of money to cement its own position, but, what is it actually spending money on? And the things that really feature, if we look here, we see that the proportion of the global world product is 6%, and yet the percentage of cement consumption is 50%, the steel is 33%, the aluminium is 25%. It's all building cities, it's all investment in infrastructure. And so, the Chinese people themselves, they're not getting the money at the moment, and yet they're building all of these cities, and it's this terrifically future-orientated idea about the way in which things should be developed. There's a pig there as well. The 50% of pigs is interesting for many reasons, but I'm not going to go into it now. Anyway, so the point is that, it's this notion of there's a real future. Like, everybody in China at the moment is getting the short end of the stick. They're not getting the money, the people in the West are getting the low inflation, the government's cooping it all up, but it's putting it into building these cities, and it's constructing a new society. It's literally the construction of a new society. That's what the book's called, The Chinese Dream, a construction of a new society. It's building the future, and that's, the way in which things are supposed to be moving forwards for China. And, where is it actually going to go? And so, just to finish, the primary objective of the 2007 11th five-year plan, what was the headline thing that Hu Jintao specified was going to happen with, and it was about, a more harmonious society, better distribution of wealth. And they said, we're going to build a new socialist countryside. And I think that's something which is, it brings things around nicely from Neville's discussion of, what actually is happening in the countryside and the way in which urbanization is occurring across the countryside, and, how that's affecting urbanization. And so that rounds up what we have to say for this evening, I think.